Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pestana. And we're here today with special guest, Sally Norton. And she's here to share with us her new book, Toxic Superfoods: How Oxalate Overload is Making You Sick and How to Get Better. At the age of 12, Sally decided that she was going to help people avoid illness and study nutrition. Since then, she's been researching what we should eat for vitality, performance, and disease-free longevity. Sally received her bachelor's degree in nutritional science from Cornell University and a master's degree in public health from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's noted as a leading expert in dietary oxalate. For 5 years, Sally managed the National Institute of Health funded program at the UNC Medical School. This project educated students and faculty about holistic, alternative, and integrative healing. So welcome to the show, Sally Norton.
Hey, thank you, Marianne. It's fun to be with you.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here to talk about this new book. What inspired you to write this?
Well, I had all these connections in health and healthcare, being in the field myself, and I've had all these health problems. And I was so shocked when I finally figured out what it is. And I realized if someone like me with a degree in nutrition and public health who was into integrative medicine, so I knew not only worked in hospitals with conventional healthcare, but I knew all these folks in the sort of alternative healing arts, and none of them could help me. If I couldn't help myself, no one can figure this out on their own. So I felt this obligation. I had spent this whole lifetime and career wanting to prevent illness and suffering for myself and make that available to anyone else who's interested in that same outcome, and failing at it terribly. So this book is my mea culpa, what I did wrong on the road to trying to be healthy and what a shipwreck it really turned out to be.
Well, I just had such a great appreciation for your book. I learned so much. And it was really interesting to hear how these superfoods probably aren't as super as we think.
No, we're getting super fooled by them. In fact, I've wondered scientifically, how could it be that we're picking foods that are pretty toxic for us? If we use them on a regular basis, they become toxic, whereby, it's slowly, by having this oxalate toxic nutrition style that we're promoting right now, is slowly draining our health. Each meal is subtly causing acute toxicity to cells like the immune cells in your blood, your stomach and intestines, your liver, your nerves, your brain, your bones, your kidney, and it's all sort of subclinical. We don't know what's happening. And so how could we, be ignoring this? Well, we're being fooled by some of our theories. I think the more we think we know, we're pretty full of ourselves of what we think we know from kind of scientific side and cultural side, and we're so convinced we're right. We've blinded ourselves to something that's getting us in trouble secretly and trying to ignore it. It's not working.
Well, is this something that a lot of people suffer from and just don't know it?
Yeah, it's so normalized now. We're all tending to eat foods that have too much of this in it. And so many of us have inflammation issues and digestive issues. If you have digestive inflammation, you really can't eat these foods without getting too much of it gets through that inflamed gut into your bloodstream. So nobody's looking at this problem. This is fairly innovative idea it's quite countercultural. It's dominant, it's challenging the dominant narrative in science. So there hasn't been a lot of funding for this, looking into this. There hasn't been a lot of expertise rising to the challenge, like how do we define this and who's affected by it. I would like us to do that science to know, but just from working with people and living in the world we live in, it seems to me that a minimum of 1 out of 4 of us is walking around with frank signs of health problems because we're eating too much of this oxalate which is dominant in these superfoods. And I think it fits with the superfood concern because we've got this theory about phytonutrients and plants having magic stuff that's somehow magically not causing problems, in fact, saving us from aging and antioxidant powers and this and that. And it could be that what's happening is the plants have these chemicals that's helping them do well, and actually helping the plant defend itself from the toxins it's making that's hurting us. So this oxalate is also toxic to other life forms, and plants themselves have to manage their oxalate carefully. And I think the ones that are high in oxalate tend to be high in these other fancy chemicals that we think are heroes. So there may be a reason why so many of the foods that are high in oxalate, we also think of them as superfoods, because we have this idea that plants have these chemicals that are beneficial to us, which has really never been. In fact, it's been disproved that these things we call antioxidants in plants are antioxidants at all. That was a quick back of the envelope way to talk about it in the 1980s, and the research since that time has demonstrated that that's not at all how this works. But we're so committed to that concept that it gives us one of many reasons why we're choosing to ignore this. So I can't really tell you how many of us, but I think normal stuff is happening from a normal diet that's normally too high in oxalate. And that normal stuff is, you're in your 40s, you start to fall apart. You have hard menopause. You start to have osteoporosis, or osteopenia is where that usually starts. And, chronic disease is huge now. Maybe 60% of us have at least one chronic disease. Depression and anxiety, drug addiction, eating disorders, these things are becoming really common. Obesity is still a big problem. It's a new problem that we keep thinking we're going to solve, and we don't. Pain syndromes, arthritis, and things like fibromyalgia are more and more common. And we get old with those pain syndromes and start to call it, old age arthritis. And then there's dementia. And we land in the pharmacy department. By the time we're elderly, we're on an average of 6, 7, 8, 9 drugs, none of which should be normal, but is. And I think the normal diet is failing us.
So when you talk about oxalate, what is that really, so that we really understand how this affects us?
Yeah, it's something nobody ever hears the word oxalate. Even when you get a calcium oxalate kidney stone, the doctor just calls it a stone or calcium, and they ignore the word oxalate. So even if you have the most obvious oxalate toxicity problem of getting repeated kidney stones, the doctor doesn't even say the word oxalate. So of course, nobody knows what it is. It's a little chemical. It starts off as oxalic acid. It's a very, very small 2-carbon chemical with a bunch of oxygen on it. And it drops its proton and becomes a charged ion with a 1 or 2 charges. And that gives it this chelation power. It likes to grab minerals. Minerals are attracted to it. That plus and minus, opposites attracting thing is happening very strongly with oxalic acid. And it's so good at it that we use it as a cleaning agent. It can pick up rust out of your patio or clean the rust off an old engine. It bleaches cellulose fibers, so you can use it as a wood bleach and a fabric bleach. They've used it in industry since the late 1700s to prepare cottons for dyeing, and then to solidify the dye process. We use it to repair antiques and get old stains out of wood. It's still used heavily. It's in Barkeeper's Friend and Zud and that kind of thing. And that's because it's one of the ways it's doing this is this grabbing of the iron and the other minerals that cause stains. So oxalates are the family of compounds related to oxalic acid. There's the acid and the various charges it can have. And then there's these compounds that it forms with minerals. There's calcium oxalate and potassium oxalate and magnesium oxalate and so on. So they're called oxalates, plural. And you eat calcium oxalate crystals that plants make, and you eat oxalic acid, both. And the crystals are pretty tough. They're hard, like quartz. They're harder than your teeth. If you chew on them, they wear down the enamel on the teeth. They're pretty abrasive. It's like sandpaper, fine, invisible sandpaper that's pretty hard on the cells of the digestive tract. But so is the acid. Both the acid and the crystals can cause membrane damage to cells. And the acid parts float in water between the cells of the gut and enter the bloodstream along with the water and fluids in your food. So an example of that might be almond milk. Almonds are high in oxalate, And when we make almond milk, it's mostly the soluble oxalic acid that's in the almond milk. And it's not a gigantic amount in almond milk because almond milk is mostly water. But all that water so nicely dissolves the oxalic acid that all that oxalic acid can easily get into the bloodstream. So in a dilute solution of, say, a smoothie or an almond milk or juice, the oxalic acid has easier access to your body tissues and your blood and your immune cells and so on. So oxalates are acid plus these crystals and these different forms. Plants make it. It's in other places in nature. It's pretty common chemical that no one's ever heard of.
So what kind of common foods does this show up in? I know you mentioned almonds. What other foods that people aren't even aware of that this would be in?
Yeah, well, in childhood, you might be introduced to a high oxalate food as a baby if they give you sweet potatoes as a child, or white potatoes, or peanut butter, whole wheat toast, because the bran is high in oxalate, chocolate is high. So just sort of standard childhood foods, and those things get made into junk foods like chips and fries. Then in the vegetable world, beyond potatoes, there are the 3 leafy greens that are high in oxalate, the biggest one being beet greens and red stemmed Swiss chard. And chard, all kinds of chard are very high, and so is spinach. So it's beet greens, chard, and spinach. All the other greens are not high. A lot of beans, like black beans, pinto beans, and white beans that we make like Boston baked beans with, they're high. The sort of non-gluten grains are also really high. The quinoa, teff, buckwheat, these sort of gluten-free alternative, they call them pseudo grains sometimes. And then a lot of seeds and nuts, because the plants protect their seeds, which is the baby of the plant, with oxalate. And they stores calcium in the seed with oxalate and stores it kind of on the outside that helps to create a nice hard crust to a seed. But it also is a way of storing calcium. So things like chia, hemp, in addition to the almonds, there's cashews, peanuts, and most nuts are high. Sesame is high. Certain spices, especially turmeric, is high. And then in the fruit department, there's kiwi, blackberry, pomegranate, star fruit, things like that. So these are really popular, and we're told to eat a lot of them, but it turns out that may not be very good advice.
I know a lot of people have been told that turmeric will help with inflammation. So it sounds that this is really kind of counter to what the science is saying.
Yep, because oxalate is a pro-inflammatory chemical. Luckily, if you really love the flavor of turmeric, you can use curcumin extract, and extracts tend to remove the oxalate. And that's a great case where whole root turmeric, which is the popular whole food version of it, is very high in oxalate, but curcumin extracts that are most supplements are low.
Well, that's good to know. I think that's encouraging for a lot of people to look for alternatives. If one of these foods ends up on this oxalate list that they may want to just know about.
Yeah, because it really is. It's fairly simple once you get this lens of thinking oxalates and knowing that list of foods. It's really easy to have a romaine salad instead of a spinach salad, and use lettuce and cabbage and watercress and these other things, and use black-eyed peas and chickpeas and green peas instead of the beans. And really, there's the whole bigger conversation about how much plants can humans tolerate, and how really does that promote good health or not, when our ecologic niche for the last 2 million years has been as a hunter and gatherer living in the ice age, not living on spinach.
Yeah, I don't see them making smoothies in any of the pictures they have, so.
Yeah, there's very, very few smoothies when you wear a bear skin and run around with a spear. Yeah.
So if someone is going, okay, well, I eat these, so how can they tell if their system is getting any toxicity from oxalate?
Yeah, so if you have unexplained anything and nothing seems to help it much, and it pops up and comes and goes, and it's kind of variable in intensity and just is this sort of weird thing that seems erratic, that might be a sign that your system is struggling with this and trying to hide the symptoms from you, but they peek out. if you eat a meal that's really high in oxalate and then 4 hours later you feel a little off or you start getting hiccups or twitches or something, then you're definitely getting a neurotoxicity effect from the oxalate. Because of course, if you're taking away minerals and messing up electrolytes because you're this chelating acid who's mucking around with those things in your blood and tissues, it will cause your nerves to be goofy and sometimes overstimulated. So if you have intermittent problems with diarrhea or constipation, that could be a spastic thing. Or if you have problems swallowing sometimes, or even a bit of reflux, or just something like sort of dysmotility, you might call it, in the whole digestive tract, that might be a sign. In fact, digestive problems are considered pretty standard part of the toxicity of this. There's a neurological toxicity that can also cause mood problems. So I've been really surprised and ultimately pleasantly surprised to hear how many people who suffered with long-term anxiety and sort of low mood or depressive tendency, how they feel completely recovered from that now that they quit eating their high oxalate diet. And some people have said they've been in therapy for 30 years with anxiety. So that's an example of a neurotoxicity. If your brain doesn't do joy and enthusiasm and excitement for your day, if you overwhelm easily with your to-do list, or if you have days when you just really don't think straight or can't spell today, those are all signs that the cells of the brain are struggling with a bit of an energy crisis. And that's the sort of thing that oxalate can create. Another thing too is just sort of inflammation that comes and goes. And sometimes it shows up as joint pain, some weakness or some swelling or, loss of strength in joints. That can be a sign too. Common one.
Is there a way that people can take a quiz to kind of figure out where they're at and if they're at risk?
I have one on my website. It's called the Exposure and Symptoms and Exposure Inventory, and it also has a section of risks. So you see if you're at risk for high absorption or poor excretion, which is your kidney's job. If you've had kidney issues or have family history of kidney issues, you may not be the best at excreting the oxalate. And if you have gut inflammation or celiac or any kind of stuff like that, you're going to absorb a lot more. So those would be the risks. And then on that sheet, you can sort of look at the history of, have you been using these foods a lot? And then look at the symptom list and see if you hit a few different patterns of symptoms in there. That'll give you a sense that something to pay attention to. And I think most of us really, if you just think about those foods, if you've gotten too cozy with those foods, you need to reconsider that and just start noticing if you eat a lot of them, if you see any changes in your well-being, or if you get rid of them for 4 days, do you see any? That, to me, that's the best way to tell. Doesn't always work for everyone because everyone's so unique. And there's so many factors that play into how the symptoms play out or not, because in many diseases, there is no symptoms until it's late stage. Many, cancer, hypertension, you name it. You really often have no idea that you're sick until someone does some sort of diagnostic for you. And unfortunately, medicine doesn't have a good set of diagnostics for us clinically, but there are a few, and I list them in a book. I have a whole chapter in the book, Toxic Superfoods, about, well, there's no good test, but here's a list of tests that might give you some clues. And one of them would be if you get a urine analysis, which isn't that common anymore. That used to be part of the standard annual physical way back in the day, but that's not really standard practice anymore. But you should ask your primary care doctor to do a urine analysis when you go in for kind of just a routine visit. If you ever see a result that says you've got blood in the urine, that's a sign of kidney stress. And I wish I had known to take that seriously when my husband had that, because he had been struggling with carpal tunnel and neck pain and disturbed sleep that he thought was just because of the pain. And he worked so hard at work to keep getting the ergonomics people to check his environment at work, because we think of carpal tunnel as this repetitive stress problem. He kept buying new pillows, and eventually it got better, and he thought it was the pillow. And then I realized it was because I had gone on this low oxalate diet and insisted that he quit eating all those French fries and black beans when he's getting lunch out at work. We accidentally fixed his carpal tunnel and sleep disorder. And that was all connected to the fact that he had that blood in the urine. And the reason is because it's the same cause. The kidneys were being stressed by the high oxalate diet I was preparing for us, and it was showing up for him as sleep problems and pain.
And for you, I know you went through joint pain and some insomnia as well.
Oh yeah, I did. And I didn't even realize that my sleep was bad. I was too tired to know I wasn't sleeping. So that's another part of this. It's so normalized and you just don't even have, I mean, a sleep lab study costs a lot of money and it isn't normally ordered. So you don't usually get to go off and do a $3,000 test or whatever it costs. Unless the doctors feel pretty desperate, they don't know what to do with you. And that happened with me. And I was surprised to learn from this sleep study that was done a year or so after I had my hysterectomy, and all those problems had caused me to lose my career. I just quit my job. I couldn't function. And that sleep study showed my brain was waking up 29 times every single hour all night long.
That's just insane.
Of course you can't write grants anymore. Of course you can hardly read your mail. Your brain never sleeps. And that's the neurotoxicity. So and along with that, you get that twitching. I remember I was saying you get twitching like hiccups and spasms and stuff. So the twitching they call it periodic limb movement disorder. So there was a bit of arm and leg movements that went along with that wakeful brain. That's all part of the neurotoxicity. And I took a lot of research, and it was through the goal of like, okay, I've got to sleep in order to have a life. And in order to sleep, I need to figure out what's making me not sleep. And the literature says it's a toxicity problem. And that the typical explanation that's currently favored is it's some kind of dysbiosis or overgrowth of bacteria in the bowels and the small intestine. So I thought I needed to fix that because I also had a lot of bloating and belching and just really terrible GI symptoms. And I thought it looked like this overgrowth, too many bacteria fermenting will make you bloated. But the other thing that will make you bloated is this neurotoxicity that gives you the belching and the dysmotility. And that dysmotility causes bloat because whatever gases are forming are getting trapped. And so it's not necessarily an overgrowth. In my case, it was not an overgrowth, but I insisted on treating it because I was desperate to sleep. But in that whole process of trying to fix my broken gut, realized that oxalate was causing my arthritis pain. And then I was like, oh man, I have to do this too. And I have these other problems. And I did this thing with this oxalate, whatever. And lo and behold, my brain started coming back within a few days. By 10 days on not eating oxalates, my sleep disorder was melting away.
I think a lot of people want to sign up for that right now, because we live in a culture where people are just, we're like deprived of sleep. And it's, we're getting to the point where you talked about, it's like normal now.
We're so fatigued. We're pushing so hard to look normal and get everything done. And it's just sucking on the backside of it. It's just hard.
I like how you have the list of foods to just pay attention to in your book. I found that to be very helpful because you could go through going, okay, well, this is stuff I have in my pantry and I could substitute this for this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I never wanted to tell people how to eat, especially never wanted to say, well, don't eat this stuff. Don't eat. Who wants to be that like waving your finger at people? I never wanted to do that. So when I started teaching this, I was going to the local health food store for free and giving talks there. And I made such a big effort to bring food. I would make a hummus made with cauliflower that was delicious. I was developing all these low oxalate recipes. I was putting out a spread for free. I wasn't getting paid for these talks. I was spending a lot of time and money to show them all the foods they could have because I felt so much I didn't want to tell anybody they couldn't have something. So I was really hypersensitive to that. But what I have learned from the people who are learning from me is that they don't need to be babied like that. They find this so easy compared to what they've had to do for these problems that won't go away. They end up all being told to go gluten-free and dairy-free. And that's really hard to be that strict with gluten and dairy. And it makes everything worse because when you go gluten-free, you start picking up on those more stuff that's sweet potatoes. Like I did, I went wheat free. That's what got me using sweet potatoes is in my 30s. I started using that as my daily starch to replace bread and things. And you start using, buckwheat noodles and looking into quinoa. And these gluten-free breads are loaded with almond flour and arrowroot and tapioca and brown rice flour and bran and seeds and nuts. They're gluten-free, but they're really high in oxalate. And so people get worse and worse, and they keep twisting themselves into knots and eliminating more foods. And when I come along and say, well, here's the high oxalate foods, this is actually so much easier for them. So I don't feel a need to baby people anymore, but I do try to give people a lot of information in the book so they see there's plenty of foods to eat.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. And when we talk about that, I know you have a list of grains that we should pay attention to. What do you use?
For grains and starch?
Yeah.
Well, I use very little grains and starch anymore. I've gotten away from that. I use some bagged chestnuts on the trail when I'm hiking because it's a great little dash of carbs for hiking to get you back down the trail with energy. I occasionally make pancakes with something called Singota flour, which is something you have to get at an Indian store, and potato starch. I use potato starch a lot for thickening things. I like to make sauces and use a nice quality potato starch. I also like to roll like some of my fish and cook it in ghee in a pan, and potato starch makes a really lovely crust. What else? I cook winter squash occasionally as a starch, but basically I eat a pretty low carb diet and use some fruits for carbs and some coconut water. But I have found that I feel better. And to really finish healing my gut, I went to a full meat diet for quite a while, and then added it back in foods and to, at that point, see how my system is doing on them and kind of highly customize it. I highly recommend that people don't necessarily do what I do, but we want to customize something that's working for you at the moment, because it'll change as you start to heal. Things change. I had to go off eggs for years, and now I'm happily eating eggs again, which is fun. And that's the ultimate goal, is you get your immune system and your gut healed enough that you can expand your diet, not restrict it. But that doesn't mean you would want to go back to the thing that broke your health.
No, not especially when you go through an elimination diet like that.
Yeah. Well, and it's actually kind of fun because it's an adventure in creativity. It's like necessity brings out your creative powers and your sense of self-sufficiency and your sense of triumph. And it actually is easy when you start living on less carbohydrates because you're not hungry. If you eat more butter and fish and meat, you're just happy and you're not hungry. So it's actually kind of easy once you learn to do it. The problem now is that we've been really lulled into this kind of a bit of underskill and underactivity in our own kitchens. We tend to have big, beautiful kitchens with lovely countertops, but marketers and other, our busy lives has made it very convenient to do grab and go style eating and snack eating and so on. And we've lost the kind of mom and pop idea of a nightly dinner with the family, a hot breakfast and a nightly dinner. Those things have gone out of fashion, but I think they need to come back into vogue again.
One of the things I read in your book that I found to be just remarkable, and not in a good way, is how oxalate creates our bodies to go through this malnourished, we're in this malnourished state.
It's really shocking that we think we're getting nutrients from these foods when in fact, they're creating mineral deficiencies and vitamin deficiencies, and then creating the ion disturbance and oxidative stress and broken metabolism that needs more nutrients. And that when you have all this inflammation being triggered by that deficiency, your deficiencies get worse. So it becomes this perpetuating cycle too. And that's the fundamental cause of all disease, is this deficiency and toxicity. Oxalate is a toxin. It's creating toxicity mess, and it's creating deficiency along with it, which is part of why it's toxic. And the two of those are the two ugly twins of all disease and aging.
So for those who are on like a whole food diet or a paleo diet, is there myths around that we need to be aware of?
Oh, yeah, they're riddled with myths, unfortunately. The idea of whole foods is interesting. We think, and we're ignoring traditional wisdom with them too, with the whole foods idea, which is sort of a complicated thing to get into. But you can see it in the turmeric thing, where if we think the whole root turmeric is better, when in fact the extract is made safer for us. We think the brown rice is better than the white rice, and yet the Asian countries have been carefully polishing and processing white rice to make it safer to eat and not wreck your gut. If you get rid of the bran and the anti-nutrients in the bran, it's more nutritive. It's just because there's so many potential nutrients in the bran. We think if we eat them, we'll get them. But the bran and the oxalates and so on in the bran causes them to be not only not available to us, but to cause more deficiency. So this is a great fallacy in my field of nutrition. I learned at Cornell, where I got my nutrition degree, that brown rice had twice the nutrients of white rice. But that's only if you're a lab chemist, not if you're a human digestive tract and a human body. It doesn't have twice the nutrients because bioavailability, that is, can those nutrients be delivered to and utilized by the cells of your body? No, they cannot. So that's the big fallacy in whole foods nutrition, is we're just using this kind of laboratory calculation, which is emblematic of the problem that we have, where we've really left all the thinking to academics and this sort of technocratic approaches rather than a more naturopathic approach of going, well, what is the wisdom of humans over the last 2 million years? And why have we been doing these practices? And why don't we think about anthropology and think about us as living beings inside a ecosystem rather than think of everything as something we can figure out technologically? And that, because that's getting us into trouble, the sort of relying on technocratic and elite academics to tell us what's true rather than knowing what the human wisdom is. So there's where whole foods diets are really more of a technocratic thing disguised as a kind of a crunchy granola, like tree hugger. Like, so that's the mind warp of it, is that what we think of as whole foods is really coming from a more technocratic way of thinking rather than an honest being part of the ecosystem. I mean, that all sounds strange, but I'll just escape that attempt to explain that and move over to the paleo question, because paleo, the way we interpret paleo was initially, well, they don't eat grains and beans and probably don't use dairy. Well, that's so simplistic and incomplete. And then one of the major purveyors of the paleo concept was saying we ate lean meats because the wild deer in the forest of Vermont aren't very fatty. When none of that's true. We hunted for the fatty animals. We would go for the visceral fat and only eat animals that were fatty, and went for the organ meat and the bone marrow, where that's almost pure fat. And we trained dogs who could survive on lean tissue, and we would feed the dogs the muscle meats. The things we think of as the prime cuts now were not prime to us at all. Historically, we always favored fat in animals and favored the parts of the animals that were fatty and high nutrient density. So our modern invention of the concept of paleo is not respecting of the true past.
So as we look at oxalates and the different diets that are affected by it, as well as the different illnesses that are coming up, it doesn't seem that medical professionals are equipped to deal with anything other than the symptoms.
Yep. And so we are settling for that. We're settling for Band-Aid thinking rather than saying, I want to know the root cause. Now, a lot of people who are picking up my information are root cause seekers. They know they're fundamentally not designed to fall apart and be arthritic and in pain. They know there's some underlying thing causing it, and they want to get at the root cause. But most of us as a culture are settling for Band-Aids.
Is there any type of test that our doctors can do to determine how much oxalate is in our system?
No, there isn't. There really is not. Because oxalate is being handled in the body in ways that we can't measure and that we don't fully understand. It's ending up getting trapped in tissues. And actually, when we quit eating oxalate, we tend to have higher levels of oxalate coming out into the bloodstream and back into the kidneys and out through the urine, because the body's been sequestering it or hanging onto it and trying to keep the blood safe so that you wouldn't mess up the heartbeat, because the heart is a muscle. The pacemaker is very sensitive to the calcium levels in the blood. If the calcium levels drop because of high oxalate foods in the blood or in the fluids around the heart muscle, you'll get arrhythmias, and they can get so bad you can literally get heart block, which is a complete failure of the heart, and that can cause death, obviously. So the body's careful to not let that happen. And so it tends to hold on to oxalates. And oxalates from our diet do get kind of hung up and stuck in tissues. Some of it's probably hanging around in the liver, because the liver is the first major organ after the gut to get the oxalate that comes from our food. And then it goes up to the heart. This is the circulation of the blood, draining the nutrients from the digestive tract, taking them to the liver for processing and cleaning and whatever. And that swell is, flooding the liver with oxalates. And the liver can't protect us from the oxalates. It has no enzymes, no reactions that it can do to disarm those oxalates or break them down. In fact, the liver metabolism creates additional oxalate. So after your meal, you hurt the liver. There's probably some oxalate hanging around in the liver because of that, but it's also draining the liver of its glutathione that it uses to protect its own cells. So if it's using up so much of its own antioxidant self-defense to help itself, that means you have less of those detox powers for dealing with the toxins that it's designed to help you with. But so the whatever is hanging around in the liver might end up as gallstones or gall sludge, but we don't have a good way to measure any of that. Some of that's in indetectable forms. And if it gets hung up in the heart muscle or our thyroid gland or our bones and our bone marrow, which is a common, I think, where ultimately it moves to as the body's having to hold on to it, you can't measure that. And you can't measure how and when it's coming out very well without testing every single urine void you do all the time. So there's not an easy way to monitor this from a kind of testing side.
And so how does one go about safely getting to this place where they're detoxing off of oxalate?
Yeah, I spend a fair amount of time in the book trying to explain that if you do an abrupt shift, which some people do because they're so sick, they're on a strict, some people go straight from vegan to full carnivore. So they've got a complete flop from all plants to no plants. And the oxalates are coming from the plant foods, not the animal foods. So when you do that, you've probably gone from a very high oxalate history to a sudden low oxalate. And that's a signal that tells the body that it's safe. The coast is clear. The blood isn't getting more oxalate from the diet. And that if the kidneys can handle it, the tissues will start clearing out oxalate. So you don't want to do that too abruptly, because if you can do this more subtly, the body may not respond with such a strong, sort of what I call sort of puking out the oxalates from the tissues. It's going to hopefully happen more gradually. Now, this is interesting because some people, the minute they slow down on their oxalates, they get a sense that they're clearing oxalate from the tissue. And the way they know that is they start getting funny symptoms. And sometimes you get very concrete signs that this is occurring. So that might be things like cloudy urine, because you're peeing out enough oxalate that it's crystallizing in the urine and it looks cloudy. Tartar on the teeth, because the saliva glands concentrate oxalate 10 to 30 times of the level of the blood. So when the blood level rises, because let's say the thyroid gland or the bone marrow is releasing oxalate, it goes back into the blood as oxalic acid. And that means your saliva will be higher in oxalate during that time. And it often will show up as increased tartar on the teeth. You get the same thing with eye fluids, where the grit and the sort of sleepy stuff that collects in your eyes overnight is thicker. Yeah, I've woken up with my eyelids literally glued together with gunk, or had white crust all dried on the side of my face near my eyes, because the eyes are a major place where oxalates collect in the body, and is also a place where people tell me they have all kinds of stuff happening there. Some people literally get skin signs. They'll get a rash. I got the rash, but I didn't get this crystals popping out. People will get little blisters sometimes that pop out crystals, or they say, I'm shedding white dust. It's like I have fine dandruff all over my body. So the skin will sometimes give you a sense that this is happening as well. It's kind of crazy. I mean, I can't believe how many people have sent me pictures of chunks of quartz coming out of their body. This is the body shedding this what we call dystrophic calcium. And many forms of calcium can be as a result of oxalate problems, weirdly enough, because oxalate is disturbing calcium management by cells and forcing more calcium to get in the cells. So the cells end up kind of filling up with inappropriate calcium. And so it can be ultimately the calcium junk that's coming out may not always be calcium oxalate. It could be other forms of calcium. And it's related to you changing your diet, getting rid of the oxalates, because it's allowing your body to finally get over this loss of control over calcium, and having to have calcium deposits is a undesirable way of protecting us from this mess that it's creating.
Are there lifestyle adjustments we should make as well?
Yes, it depends on your lifestyle. But you may, if you're sick because of oxalates, if you're really struggling with your health, you're in no position to force yourself to be the chairman of all the committees and working full time and hosting all the family parties. Like, you might need to take a break and just clean out your calendar and reduce your hours at work, and like give yourself time off so that you can heal. And when you need a nap, you can respect that. And if you need more time to be rethinking your lifestyle, give yourself that time. And so one of them is quit driving yourself to do too much and really prioritize sleep. Hopefully pick up a sauna habit and do more with nature and sunshine and art and those things that promote healing. Those are just fundamentally good for all of us. And if you're sick, they're really helpful.
I like how in your book you talk about vitamin sunshine.
It really is a vitamin. I think it's a sort of energy source. We were back in the Ice Age, when we were busy hunting woolly mammoth. We spent a lot of time outdoors. we really only invented the indoor housing thing. And now that we have the central air and air conditioning and heat, we spend so much time not in the sun, but we're really designed to be out in the sun. It's just that modern people have developed a sun sensitivity with a high plant diet. Plants have chemicals that make us sun sensitive. A high seed oil diet. The seed oils are the wrong fats for your membranes and make your membranes more damageable by sunlight and so on. So our diets and our lifestyle has made us sun sensitive, but we're fundamentally not. And we fundamentally have the tools in our normal healthy physiology to tolerate a lot of sun exposure. And it is a vitamin. It's an energy source that we need to return to. But in order to do it safely, we need smarter ways of eating.
Now, I know you mentioned nuts. So a lot of people, if they're not doing almond milk, they're doing coconut milk or coconut oil. Is that the same type of category that they should watch that?
Coconut oil is a nice short chain saturated fat. So it's really good. We need those short and medium chain fats. They're quite good for the gut flora and for cells. They don't go rancid like the seed oils do. So the beautiful thing about saturated fats is they can't spoil and become toxic fats. They're really quite neutral and important for our health. So that's perfectly safe. And coconut also has the added advantage of being low in oxalate. And if you think about it, a coconut, probably human beings have lived on the shore and chosen warm, sunny beaches as a great place to live for a long time. And we've probably been using coconuts, certainly in the Polynesian islands and where there's coconuts, and through the tropical belt of the world, coconuts have probably been a major part of human diets for a long time.
Well, thank you for answering that, because I was looking at your book. I was like, I wonder about that. Yeah, because
Yeah,
a lot
that's
of people
interesting.
will switch that or soy, or there are different other. If they feel like they're looking for a milk alternative, there's like only a few
I
things that
like
really good.
coconut a lot. I use it. And if I have this little PDF recipe book, it's got about 190 recipes in it on my website. And you'll see in those recipes that I use coconut milk a lot because I'm offering dairy-free recipes and do dairy-free for myself too, because this damage that oxalates have caused has made me kind of sensitive to dairy. Unfortunately, we have lovely raw milk and raw cream available. It's my husband gets it every week, but I restrain myself and use coconut a lot and like it.
Well, they're good alternatives. So that thank goodness we've got those.
Yeah, there's always food to eat. It's just a matter of your creativity and your willingness to get out of your own rut.
And be willing to try something new.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, if you're not willing to try something new, maybe you're becoming an old fart, stop doing that. Be interesting.
So and I'd love for you to share this again. I know we talked about this at the beginning of our discussion, but once you started looking at the oxalate in your bloodstream and just in your body, how long, and you're making this switch, how long was it that you started to see changes happen?
Yeah, so it's interesting because often there's a short-term benefit right away, kind of this honeymoon where the first 3 or 4 days you can definitely see, wow, things are better. I'm liking this. And then if your body starts clicking in this clearing reactions, I call it, there's inflammation involved, there's more oxalate toxicity involved, and you can go back to the same, it looks the same. It's like, oh, this didn't work after all. And then those go away again. And it's like you kind of feel like this little voodoo doll where things can come and go. And that's just a normal part of the body's healing. And there's a lot in my book about, well, you don't want to let that get out of hand. But I've had people come to me where they don't start getting those clearing reactions to like the third year. They go from a keto diet full of almond flour, and it takes them 3 years on a full meat carnivore diet, which is this growing trend now. It's small, but massively enthusiastic. People are very enthusiastic about it. And I think it's because they're all going on low oxalate, and you feel so much better when you don't have these plant poisons. But this clean out, you've got potentially massive amounts compared to what you're supposed to have, which is none, of crystals in your thyroid gland, in your bones and bone marrow, and in your tendons and so on. It takes a very long time to get this stuff out. I'm still clearing oxalate myself. I've been doing this diet for over 9 years. It's been 9 years and like 3 months now. And I'm still seeing oxalate coming. It's easy now. It's not that disruptive. But it's a long process to recover. And that's one reason why those of us who really overdid our sweet potatoes and Swiss chard are like trying to please don't be like me and give yourself this chronic disease, because you're building up a chronic toxic load in your body that creates a long-term chronic disease. So the recovery is fantastic because we get back our lives. We're good enough to write books and have interviews and work, but it would have been better to not go through all of this because the recovery time can be prolonged.
It's like more of a journey as opposed to you'll be fixed in 30 days.
Absolutely. Absolute. That's exactly right. And anyone who's trying to fix you in 30 days isn't being truthful. That's not how real healing works, especially of a deep toxicity disease. Like I fear that we have, because we're raising everybody on potatoes and peanuts and then throwing in the spinach and actually bribing our kids. If you eat your spinach, you can have your chocolate ice cream. And we're just overusing these so much. I feel like we're heading into even worse public health crises with diseases that are hard to treat and aren't understood. So if we could save some people from doing that, that would be fantastic.
My goodness, Sally. We could talk forever. You're just such a wealth of information when it comes to this topic. What final thoughts do you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I really hope that you will take a chance to give yourself some time to think about this topic and consider playing around with it and reading my book, because this is a great chance to get a whole new perspective on things and step back from a dominant culture that isn't working for us in so many ways. So I'm just really grateful that people are listening to our conversation and that you took interest in the book and the topic, because it's really fun to be healing and to feel hopeful about old age. I feel more confident and energetic and free of these worries that hang on you when you're sick. To be able to just walk away from them is a glorious thing to do. And I really hope your listeners will give themselves a chance to try this out.
I think it'll help a lot of people. Why don't you share your website with us one more time?
It's sallyknorton.com, sallyknorton.com. A bunch of information there, a few things you can download. There'll be more things coming there. You can sign up for a group class if you want and sign up for my email list. I'm trying to do better about sending out emails maybe at least once a week, but you're not going to get spammed every day because I don't have a lot of bandwidth to write emails, but I'll try to keep you posted on what's going on. So, if I get hacked on Instagram again or whatever, that's the only way I can tell you is if you're on my email list. So whatever, just join me on my website for whatever you need there, and I'll try to be here to support you.
Well, Sally, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne. It's been great to be with you.
Well, thank you, Sally. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Toxic Superfoods: How Oxalate Overload is Making You Sick and How to Get Better. Toxic Superfoods is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.